Hello, and welcome back to part 2 of this special edition of the Capital Report from Seoul, South Korea. Just behind me is the Chinese embassy, a building that should stand as a symbol of diplomacy. However, as we've come to discover, it's so much more. Tonight we examine the unseen power dynamics the Chinese Communist Party manipulates to achieve its global ambitions. The CCP has its hands on a variety of nefarious activities, from covertly exerting influence to overtly leveraging its economic appeal. And equally concerning, similar strategies are at play on American soil. What exactly is their endgame? We'll find out in today's episode. A sabotage campaign leveraged against an American dance company. While receiving thunderous applause from around the world, Shenyun is having a hard time even securing a venue right here in South Korea. How does Beijing's foreign influence play into this? And why should the U.S. be concerned? We spoke with Minho Yan, former Korean government official, to find out. Mr. Han, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah.
It's nice to meet you.
Shenyun Performing Arts, it's a New York-based dance troupe, performs around the world. It's having a very hard time performing here in South Korea. It has performed here. You've seen the show.
Yes.
What did you think of the message?
현인 공연을 이제 금년 2월 달에
The Shenyun performance I saw at the National Theater in February this year was impressive. It is a performance that conveys the values of truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance, using Chinese history and traditional culture as its motif. I found it particularly interesting because South Koreans rarely have the opportunity to experience traditional Chinese performing
할 수
arts.
있는 기회가 없었기 때문에 아주 재미있게 봤어요.
What did you take away from the message in Shenyun, just in terms of the freedom of expression, the artistic value of the show? And would you recommend your fellow countrymen in Korea to see it?
네. 아까 말씀드린 것처럼 우리 한국에서
Yes, as I mentioned earlier, since South Koreans rarely have the chance to experience traditional Chinese performing arts, I recommend it to my colleagues and those around me. However, what's concerning is that Shenyun, a performance that people all around the world can see, is not allowed in China and even in South Korea. It faces interference. It's really a shame.
나라가 물론 중국이고.
Does it surprise you that theaters right here in your own backyard have canceled shows and interfered with shows of the Shenyun Performing Arts to perform in South Korea?
사실은 현인 공연이 이렇게
In fact, I didn't know until recently how persistently Shenyun performances are being obstructed by the Chinese Communist Party. Recently, it was revealed that the Chinese Communist Party exerted pressure on KBS, a major broadcasting station in South Korea, as well as important venues operated by local governments, preventing the performance. It's quite astonishing and shameful.
행사해가지고 또 이제 대학교에까지 압력을 행사해가지고 철저하게.
What actions do you anticipate the South Korean government will take? Are you confident they will take action on this issue?
이 한국 정부가 이 현인 공연
If I were in the South Korean government, I would think this way. Shenyun is not just one among many global performing arts groups. Its existence itself is evidence exposing the Chinese Communist Party's wrongdoings. It's strong evidence. Preventing Shenyun from performing means South Korea is under the influence of the Chinese Communist Party. Preventing Shenyun from performing in South Korea means that despite claiming a value alliance with the US, in reality, South Korea is compromising those values and succumbing to the directives of the Chinese Communist Party. This is a significant message and not a trustworthy stance for South Korea to convey. Urgently, in the current international situation where tensions are high and conflicts are ongoing in various parts of the world, including Ukraine and the Middle East, strengthening the alliance with the United States is crucial to prevent potential wars and safeguard the freedom and prosperity of South Korea.
이건 우리가 말로는 미국이랑 가치 동맹이다.
This situation that you're describing, it's not the Korean government's policy, and it certainly doesn't sound like it's the will of the Korean people. It sounds like it's the will of the CCP. So with that said, what would your final message be if you could talk directly to the Korean people and the people in the Korean government that may not understand this, just how urgent this is to solve?
지금 국제정세가 굉장히
When we need support, relying on the United States only when it's necessary may not foster trust from the US. it raises question about whether South Korea can be relied upon. Therefore, in the urgent circumstances we find ourselves in considering the unpredictability of potential conflicts, it becomes essential to prove that South Korea is a reliable ally. Allowing Shenyun to perform, despite the pressure from the Chinese Communist Party, would be a diplomatic and security measure to demonstrate a firm and trustworthy alliance with the U.S.
이 만드는 수밖에 없어요. 이게 정말 대한민국이 살기 위한.
Mr. Han, if you could tell us, what is the extent of CCP infiltration in your country of South Korea, and if you could provide us some specific examples.
예, 우선 중국 공산당의
First of all, the infiltration by the Chinese Communist Party is comprehensive and nationwide. In 2 words, it can be summarized as extensive and pervasive, reaching into politics, economics, culture, academia, and the media of South Korea. The Chinese Communist Party's influence is widespread, not distinguishing between local and central levels. Specific examples abound, but just to mention what's most obvious. There are 39 Confucius Institutes in South Korea, the highest number globally. These 39 institutes are strategically located from Seoul to Jeju, and notably, there is even a Xi Jinping Memorial Library in the Central Library of Seoul National University, the top university in South Korea. Politically, what I find particularly concerning is that out of the 300 seats in our National Assembly, the ruling Democratic Party holds 172 seats. However, the Democratic Party is overtly pro-China. To make matters worse, in addition to Democratic Party members, 35 lawmakers from the ruling party, the People Power Party, formed a parliamentary pro-China group called the Korea-China Parliamentary Association in December of last year. So the infiltration of the Chinese Communist Party into South Korea has progressed extensively and deeply beyond our imagination.
작년 12월에 한중의원연맹이라고 하는
Being here in South Korea, you can feel the freedom. It's still a very free and democratic country. When you go to a communist country like China, you can feel the totalitarian vibe in the air. You don't feel that here. Yet what you're telling me is these Confucius Institutes are still large in number. Meanwhile, in the United States and other parts of the world, they're being shut down. So why are they continuing to flourish in a free South Korea? And what is their objective?
우선 공작원의 목적에 대해서
Firstly, regarding the purpose of Confucius Institutes, it can be summarized into 2 main goals. One is to cultivate pro-China connections, especially breeding spies. The other is to widely spread pro-China sentiment throughout society. The result is that when Chinese individuals engage in espionage, they plan it over approximately 30 years. That's the frightening aspect. So if 20-year-olds are produced by Confucius Institutes, in 20 to 30 years, they will be in their 40s to 50s, becoming the core influential forces in society. With a background of pro-China sentiment, these elites could be elected as public officials, presidents, or members of the parliament, turning South Korea into a de facto subordinate of China without going through a battlefield. This is a foreseeable scenario.
친중화된 엘리트들이 이 선출직 공무원에 대통령으로도 선출될 수 있고.
So South Korea is obviously one of the United States' most important and key allies in this region, yet it's obvious that Beijing sees South Korea, Seoul, as vulnerable. So I guess my question is, why do you think the CCP has been so successful in infiltrating your country?
그건 이제 국제 정세 때문인데요.
That's due to international relations. South Korea normalized diplomatic relations with China in 1992. At that time, the US and China were also normalizing relations, creating a friendly atmosphere. Consequently, South Korea, being an ally of the US, also engaged in economic exchanges with China, reaping significant economic benefits. In the past 30 years, the sentiment of being pro-China has prevailed in South Korea, as it did with the US before the emergence of Trump. This international background, along with the deepening economic exchanges between South Korea and China, set the stage for the extensive infiltration of the Chinese Communist Party into various sectors of South Korean society.
그래서 그런 분위기, 국제 정세와 한국과 중국 간의 그 경제 교류의 이 확산.
So let me ask you, why should the US government in the United States care about this issue?
중국 공산당의 이 목적은 뭐냐면은
The goal of the Chinese Communist Party is to overthrow the United States and dominate the world. Therefore, from the US perspective, unless the Chinese Communist Party is overthrown, the US will fall. This thought is shared by Americans. The evidence of this is the existence of Congressional Executive Commission on China in the U.S. House of Representatives, operated jointly by Democrats and
중국
Republicans.
공산당 특별위원회가 초당적으로 민주당, 공화당이 다 합의해서
How do you believe that the South Korean government can enhance their tactics and their strategy and their defense against this infiltration?
우선 참 부끄러운 말씀을 드리자면은
First, it's embarrassing to admit that the South Korean government doesn't understand the intentions of the Chinese Communist Party. What they're planning and the dangers they pose are not well understood by the South Korean government. In contrast, other countries, such as the US, Australia, Canada, France, and the UK, have government agencies like the FBI and Congress producing reports on the infiltrations of the Chinese Communist Party. However, in South Korea, such reports are still lacking. Secondly, if I were to propose specific measures, given the urgencies of the situation, a task force to study the infiltrations of the Chinese Communist Party and devise countermeasures should be established directly under the president. It should include government officials, academics, and representatives from civic organizations, coming together to study and quickly produce at least a preliminary report on the situation. Due to time constraints, this should be done promptly. Additionally, more in-depth research should follow.
인식이 없다, 지금.
Mr. Ming-Ho Han, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Coming up, a military expert joins us to discuss the CCP's propaganda campaign outside of its borders, as well as the complex diplomatic relations between the U.S., South Korea, and Communist China. Welcome back to the Capitol Report. I'm Steve Lance. Our special coverage continues right here from Seoul, South Korea. So what is Communist China's strategy towards South Korea from a global perspective? And how should the South Korean government be responding? To find out, we sit down with Kim Tae-woo, the director of the Nuclear Security Office at Korea Institute of Military Studies. Dr. Tae-woo Kim, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for your inviting me.
Of course, we're honored to have you. Dr. Kim, I'd like you to describe, in your own words, how do you view the relationship between South Korea and China?
When we opened our diplomatic relations 30 years ago, actually a flowery path was opened ahead of our two nations, So there was explosion of personal interchange and trade and economic relations and so forth. But later, during the last 30 years, South Korea's GDP rose to 5 times, but a Chinese one skyrocketed to 35 times, Then all of a sudden, China became very expansionistic, totalitarian country, and they put out unilateral diplomacy, and increasingly assertive diplomacy, and they seems to be claiming something like suzerainty over South Korea. And unfortunately, the former government, the South Korean government, they continue the very submissive, very humiliating, in a sense, diplomacy policy toward China. So this is why President Yoon emphasized a new line of policies. He declared the importance of alliance and the importance of collaboration with democratic allies, friend countries, or something like that. So we are changing, actually. But if China doesn't accept that, then our relations should continue to be very stormy and noisy and problematic.
So why do you think that the relationship between South Korea and China should matter to the United States? And how would you describe the relationship between the United States and South Korea?
South Korea is a very important link in the United States-China policies. China, of course, regard South Korea as a vulnerable, weak link in the American encirclement of China. This is how they perceive South Korea. But if United States lose South Korea, then it will lose very, very important, strategically very important outpost in its Asia strategy. But for South Korea, if we fail, then we will fail our nation. Then you will know what will follow, you know. So that's why our strategy, our collaboration in security is a matter of die or live for South Koreans. And for United States, this is losing or not an important ally. You know.
What would you say are some of your greatest concerns when it comes to the CCP's nefarious global ambitions?
China's stance toward South Korea, toward neighboring nation is problematic. They are demanding kind of a vertical pecking order to neighboring countries. So China, Russia, Syria, North Korea, Iran, those countries, the totalitarian country or dictatorial countries, they are forming a kind of camp, you know, which scholars call a axis of totalitarianism or axis of autocracy. So they are challenging the existing international order created by the democratic countries after the Second World War. You know. So China's challenge is omnipresent. They are challenging everywhere on the world, particularly toward the United States. They compete, they challenge the U.S. in military, economy, trade, space, you know, everywhere, you know. So what can I say? If we cannot control the threat from China, particularly future threat, I mean threat to come in the future, I think we will have a worse nightmare. As I told you a moment ago, they perceive South Korea as a vulnerable link in the encirclement of America against China. So they want to destroy that, first of all. And then they want to tame South Korea, domesticate South Korea, you know. That's basically their strategy toward South Korea. And then, in order to do that, they began cultural infiltration.
Well, there's another big one that I want to ask you about. When it comes to this infiltration, like you mentioned, it's often one of the hardest things to combat because it is obscure. It's not tangible in a lot of ways. You have to connect the dots, and not many people have the time to do that. So the CCP is operating in South Korea to interfere with the Shenyun Performing Arts Show, pressuring some of the most renowned theaters in South Korea to prevent them from performing. What do you make of this?
It's really unfortunate. Still many government officials implanted by the former government is still working within the government, and their thinking is much different from what I'm thinking and what we are thinking. So the change will not be that quick as expected by American citizens, you know. So please understand that, but the change will happen slowly and steadily.
Cultural diplomacy is something that the CCP utilizes themselves in a very malign way to spread their propaganda subtly and sometimes not so subtly. And here with Shenyun, you have something that directly targets the ideology in the CCP. After people see the performance from China, they immediately align with democratic values because the show brings out freedom of expression and traditional culture. So now you have something like this that's essentially banned in South Korea. How concerning is this?
Very much concerned. We are very much concerned. That should be changed. I am also active in NGO activities, you know. We are actually trying very hard to do that. Mr. Hamino, the interviewer, he's also my colleague in doing that. He is a China specialist, you know. I'm nuclear specialist. Anyway, Many South Koreans are trying that way. And also, we are also very much concerned about the existence of the Confucius Institutes, how to kick them out and how to allow the sun wind performance in South Korea. Those kind of things are priority tasks when we talk about the cultural infiltration of CCP.
Let me ask you one last question. When it comes to the CCP's subversion or infiltration of South Korea, how important is it for the South Korean people to remember the relationship between the Chinese Communist Party and North Korea and the fact that they're both communist nations?
I should confess the situation is vulnerable in South Korea. Most of South Koreans are busy making money and make a living. They simply don't know what's happening. So if we have another different ideologically dangerous people take political power, then they will allow Chinese operation like that, so-called the propaganda operation through the Confucius Institute or banning a sun moon performance in South Korea, something like that. Then South Korea can change as a different country. So many patriotic South Koreans are trying definitely to prevent that situation. So very timely.
Dr. Kim, thank you so much.
Thank you for being with me.
That is all we have for you this evening on the Capital Report from Seoul, South Korea. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Steve Lance. Have a nice evening. Be sure to join us again for our final episode of this special coverage tomorrow.